The morning air was crisp as Margaret Chen stepped off the number 42 bus at the corner of Fifth Avenue. She adjusted the strap of her brown leather purse, the one she'd carried for nearly 15 years now. The leather was cracked in places, showing its age, but it still held everything she needed. She wore a simple floral dress that she'd bought on sale 3 summers ago, paired with comfortable walking shoes that had seen better days. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly in a bun, secured with the same tortoiseshell clip her daughter had given her for Mother's Day years back. At 63 years old, Margaret looked like someone's grandmother heading to the grocery store, or perhaps to her volunteer shift at the local library. And that's exactly what most people saw when they glanced her way. Nothing more, nothing less. Just an ordinary older woman going about her ordinary day. But today wasn't ordinary at all. Today was special. Today was the day she'd been planning for 2 months, ever since everything changed. Margaret stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the gleaming storefront before her. Belmont and Sterling. The name was etched in elegant gold letters above glass doors so clean they sparkled in the morning sunlight. Through those doors, she could see crystal chandeliers hanging from high ceilings and glass display cases that seemed to glow from within. This wasn't just any jewelry store. This was the kind of place where movie stars shopped, where people drove up in limousines, where a single necklace could cost more than most people earned in a year. She'd never been inside a place like this before. Never had a reason to. Her wedding ring had come from a small family jeweler in Chinatown, and it had been perfect. Simple, affordable, and filled with love. That's all she and Thomas had ever needed. A young couple walked past her and approached the entrance. The woman wore a designer handbag that Margaret recognized from a magazine she'd flipped through at the dentist's office. The man's watch caught the light, probably worth thousands. The doorman, dressed in a crisp uniform with gold buttons, immediately pulled the door open with a warm smile. Margaret took a breath and followed them toward the entrance. The doorman's hand was already on the door handle when he noticed her. His smile faltered for just a second. His eyes traveled from her worn shoes up to her simple dress, then to her old purse. He hesitated, his hand pausing on the handle. Then, remembering his training, he opened the door, though the warmth from moments before had cooled considerably. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, giving him a genuine smile. He nodded but didn't quite meet her eyes. Stepping inside was like entering another world. The air conditioning was perfectly cool, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. The floors were polished marble that reflected the chandelier lights above. Display cases lined the walls and created islands throughout the space, each one lit to showcase the treasures within. Diamonds caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the white walls. Emeralds gleamed like deep pools of water. Sapphires sat in velvet boxes like captured pieces of sky. Margaret stood just inside the entrance, taking it all in. She'd seen beautiful things before, of course, but never quite like this. Never all together in one place. Never presented like art in a museum. There were perhaps a dozen other people in the showroom. Well-dressed customers examining pieces with sales associates hovering nearby. Everyone looked like they belonged here. Everyone except her. A young woman in a perfectly tailored black suit glanced up from the case she was organizing. Her eyes landed on Margaret, swept over her quickly, and then returned to her work. No greeting, no acknowledgement, just a brief assessment followed by dismissal. Margaret didn't take it personally. She'd lived long enough to know how the world worked. People made judgments based on what they could see. It was human nature, even if it wasn't always kind. She walked slowly along one of the display cases, her hands clasped in front of her. Inside the case, a diamond bracelet sat on a white silk cushion. Tiny stones set in platinum, probably containing more diamonds than she'd seen in her entire life combined. There was no price tag visible. She'd heard that was how it worked in places like this. If you had to ask, you probably couldn't afford it. A sales associate, a man in his 30s wearing an expensive suit and a Bluetooth earpiece, walked past her. He was heading toward a couple who had just entered, the woman draped in fur despite the warm weather outside. "Good morning, welcome to Belmont and Sterling," he said to them, his voice warm and professional. "Can I offer you some champagne while you browse?" Margaret watched this interaction while pretending to study a display of pearl necklaces. She'd been standing in the store for nearly 10 minutes now, and no one had offered her champagne. No one had offered her anything at all. She moved to another case, this one showcasing engagement rings. They sat in neat rows, each one more elaborate than the last. She thought of her own engagement ring, long ago lost when it slipped off her finger while she was washing dishes at the restaurant where she'd worked nights. She'd cried for days over that loss, not because of its monetary value, which had been modest, but because Thomas had saved for 6 months to buy it. "Excuse me," a voice said behind her. Margaret turned to find a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, standing with her arms crossed. She had perfectly styled blonde hair and makeup that must have taken an hour to apply. Her name tag read Victoria. "Yes?" Margaret said pleasantly. Victoria's smile was tight, professional, but cold. "Are you looking for something specific? Perhaps I can point you toward some of our more accessible pieces." The words were polite enough, but the meaning was clear. "You don't belong here. You can't afford anything here. Please leave." "I'd like to look at your diamond necklaces," Margaret said, keeping her voice gentle and steady. "The ones in that case over there." She pointed toward a display in the center of the room, where 3 necklaces sat under spotlights that made them glitter like captured starlight. Victoria followed her gaze and actually laughed, though she tried to cover it with a cough. "Those pieces start at $75,000, she said, her tone making it clear she thought this would end the conversation. "Yes, I assumed they were quite valuable," Margaret replied. "They're beautiful. Could I see them?" Victoria's expression shifted to something between annoyance and disbelief. "Ma'am, those are some of our premium pieces. They're they're extremely expensive. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at the jewelry counter at Macy's. They have some lovely pieces there that might be more in your price range." Other people in the store were starting to notice the interaction. An older man in a 3-piece suit glanced over, then whispered something to the woman beside him. They both looked at Margaret with a mixture of curiosity and secondhand embarrassment. Margaret felt a familiar feeling settle in her chest. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even hurt anymore. She'd felt this feeling many times throughout her life. When she and Thomas had tried to rent their first apartment, and the landlord had made assumptions based on their appearance. When she'd been followed by security in department stores. When waiters had ignored her table in fancy restaurants where she was meeting her daughter. She'd learned something important over the years, though. She'd learned that dignity wasn't something anyone could take from you. You could only give it away, and she had no intention of giving hers away today. "I understand they're expensive," Margaret said, her voice still calm and kind. "But I'd still like to see them, please." Victoria's jaw tightened. She looked around the showroom, perhaps hoping another sales associate would intervene or maybe looking for security. From a second-floor office overlooking the showroom, a man in an expensive suit was watching the scene unfold. The manager, probably. "Ma'am, I really don't think," Victoria began. "Is there a problem here?" The man from upstairs had descended and now stood beside Victoria. His name tag identified him as Raymond Whitmore, store manager. His smile was practiced and utterly fake. "No problem at all," Margaret said before Victoria could speak. "I was just asking to see some of your pieces." Raymond's eyes did the same quick assessment the doorman's had done. Worn shoes. Old dress. Cracked purse. His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "Of course," he said smoothly. "We're happy to show you our collection. However, I should mention that we do require a credit check for viewings of our premium pieces. It's store policy. For security purposes, you understand." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Margaret had been watching other customers for the past 20 minutes. No one else had been asked for a credit check. The classical music continued to play softly. Outside the windows, people walked past, going about their normal lives, completely unaware of this small moment of cruelty unfolding inside. Margaret reached into her purse. Her fingers touched the envelope she'd been carrying, the one that had arrived in the mail 2 months ago and changed everything. The one that had brought her here today, but she didn't pull it out. Not yet. Instead, she simply smiled at Raymond and Victoria. The same patient smile she'd perfected over decades of being underestimated. "That's quite all right," she said softly. "I'll just continue looking for now if you don't mind." Raymond nodded, clearly satisfied that he'd successfully discouraged her without causing a scene. "Of course. Enjoy your browsing." As he and Victoria walked away, Margaret heard Victoria whisper, "Can you believe she actually thought she could buy something here?" Margaret turned back to the display cases, her heart beating steadily in her chest. She thought about Thomas, about his gentle smile and hard-working hands. She thought about the promise he'd made on their wedding day so many years ago. "When we make it, Maggie," he'd said, using the nickname only he was allowed to use, "I'm going to buy you diamonds, real ones, the kind that sparkle like your eyes." She'd laughed and told him she didn't need diamonds. She just needed him, and she'd meant it then. She still meant it now. But Thomas was gone, and he'd left her with something she never expected. And today she was going to keep the promise he couldn't. Margaret continued walking through the showroom, her worn shoes making soft sounds against the polished marble floor. She moved slowly, deliberately, taking time to look at each display. Diamond earrings that caught the light like tiny stars. Ruby rings set in gold so pure it seemed to glow. Bracelets that must have taken master craftsmen months to create. Behind the counter, Victoria was helping another customer, a woman perhaps 10 years younger than Margaret, dressed in designer clothing from head to toe. Victoria's whole demeanor was different now. She laughed at something the customer said, her voice bright and engaged. She brought out piece after piece, laying them carefully on a black velvet pad for the woman to examine. She offered champagne, which the woman accepted with a casual wave of her hand. Margaret watched this out of the corner of her eye while pretending to study a display of sapphire pendants. The difference in treatment was so obvious it would have been funny if it wasn't so sad. But Margaret had seen this kind of thing before. More times than she could count, really. She thought back to when she was 25, newly married to Thomas, trying to buy their first car. The salesman had taken one look at them and steered them toward the oldest, cheapest vehicles on the lot. He'd spoken slowly, as if they might not understand him. He'd made assumptions about what they could afford, what they deserved, what they were worth as human beings. Thomas had stayed calm that day, too, and they'd ended up buying a good car from a different dealership. But the memory still stung, even decades later. Another sales associate, a man who looked to be in his 40s with salt and pepper hair, walked past Margaret 3 times without making eye contact. Each time he seemed to be heading somewhere important, his face focused and professional. But Margaret noticed that twice, when he passed customers in expensive clothing, he stopped to greet them, to ask if they needed any assistance, to offer his expertise. She wasn't invisible exactly. People saw her. They just chose not to see her as someone who mattered, someone who belonged, someone who deserved their time and attention. 25 minutes had now passed since Margaret entered the store. In that time, she'd watched 6 different customers receive immediate attention from sales associates. She'd seen champagne offered 4 times. She'd heard conversations about vacation homes and yacht clubs and charity galas. And she'd received exactly 0 offers of assistance beyond Victoria's thinly veiled suggestion that she shop elsewhere. Margaret paused in front of a case displaying wedding jewelry. There was a set that caught her eye, a diamond necklace with matching earrings and bracelet. The diamonds were set in a pattern that reminded her of cherry blossoms, delicate and beautiful. The kind of thing a bride might wear, or a mother of the bride. She leaned in closer, admiring the craftsmanship. "Those are from our bridal collection," a voice said. Margaret looked up to find a young man, couldn't be more than 22 or 23, standing on the other side of the counter. Unlike the others, he wasn't wearing an expensive suit. His outfit was nice but more modest, and his name tag read Daniel, sales associate in training. "They're beautiful," Margaret said, grateful for even this small acknowledgement. Daniel smiled, and it seemed genuine. "They really are. The designer spent 2 years creating this collection. Each piece is unique." He paused, then added, "Would you like to see them closer?" Before Margaret could answer, Victoria appeared beside Daniel. She put a hand on his shoulder, her long red nails standing out against his dark jacket. "Daniel, could you help me in the back? I need someone to bring up some inventory." Daniel looked confused. "But I was just about to—" "Now please," Victoria said, her voice firm. She shot him a look that clearly communicated something Margaret couldn't quite decipher. But Daniel understood immediately. His face flushed slightly, and he glanced at Margaret with what looked like an apology in his eyes. "Of course," he said quietly. "Excuse me, ma'am." As they walked away, Margaret heard Victoria's whispered words, sharp and cutting. "Don't waste your time on people who are just window shopping. Focus on real customers." Margaret stood alone at the display case once more. The cherry blossom jewelry sparkled behind the glass, beautiful and untouchable. She felt a familiar heaviness in her chest, but she pushed it away. She hadn't come here to feel sorry for herself. She'd come here for a reason, and a few rude people weren't going to change that. She moved to a different section of the store where larger, more elaborate pieces were displayed. Statement necklaces that would cover most of a woman's chest, rings so large they hardly seemed wearable, bracelets studded with so many stones they looked heavy. These were the kind of pieces that made people stop and stare, that showed up in magazines and on red carpets. A couple entered the store, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. The man was tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Margaret had spent on clothes in the past 5 years. The woman with him was younger, beautiful in that carefully maintained way that required regular visits to expensive salons and spas. She wore a dress that hugged her figure and shoes with red soles that Margaret recognized from a documentary she'd watched about fashion. Raymond, the manager, practically flew down from his office. "Mr. Harrison, Mrs. Harrison, what a pleasure to see you again." His voice was warm, genuine in a way it hadn't been with Margaret. "Please come in. Victoria, champagne for the Harrisons immediately." Victoria appeared with a silver tray bearing 2 crystal flutes of champagne before the couple had even reached the main display area. The salt and pepper-haired associate materialized beside them, ready to assist. Even Daniel emerged from the back, hovering nearby in case his help was needed. Margaret watched this performance from her position beside a display of watches. 4 staff members for 2 customers. She'd been in the store for half an hour and had been actively ignored by all of them. Mrs. Harrison sipped her champagne and surveyed the showroom like a queen surveying her kingdom. "Raymond, darling, I'm looking for something special. It's our anniversary next month and my husband insists on spoiling me." She laughed, a light tinkling sound that seemed practiced. 30 years. Mr. Harrison said, putting his arm around his wife's waist. "Only the best for my girl." Raymond clasped his hands together. Of course. I have just the thing. We received a piece last week that I immediately thought of you when I saw it. A Colombian emerald. 42 carats surrounded by white diamonds. It's truly extraordinary." As they moved to a private viewing area, Margaret noticed Victoria glance her way. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, Margaret saw exactly what Victoria thought of her. Nothing. She thought nothing of her at all. Margaret was just an inconvenience, someone taking up space in a store where she didn't belong. Margaret turned away and found herself facing a display she hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than the others, tucked into a corner, almost hidden. Inside were pieces that looked older, vintage perhaps. There was a brooch that looked like it was from the 1920s. All geometric shapes and Art Deco styling, a pair of earrings that reminded her of old Hollywood glamour, and a ring, simple compared to everything else in the store, with a single diamond set in platinum. She thought of her own lost engagement ring again. How devastated she'd been when it had slipped from her finger and disappeared down that drain. How Thomas had held her while she cried, telling her it was okay, it was just a thing. What mattered was their love. And he'd been right, of course. But she'd still mourned the loss of that physical symbol. That small circle of gold that said someone loved her. Someone had chosen her. Someone thought she was worth something precious. "Ma'am, we're going to be closing for our lunch service soon." Margaret turned to find Raymond standing behind her, his face composed in that same fake polite expression. "Lunch service?" "Yes, from 12 to 1:30 we close the showroom to prepare for our afternoon appointments. Only customers with scheduled appointments can shop during that time." He glanced at his watch, an expensive piece that probably cost more than her monthly rent used to be, back when she and Thomas had rented that tiny apartment in Queens. "It's 11:45 now." It was a lie. Margaret could see through the windows that other people were still shopping, still browsing. She could hear Victoria laughing with another customer somewhere behind her. But Raymond wanted her gone, and this was his polite way of making it happen. "I see," Margaret said softly. She looked around the showroom one more time, at all the beauty and sparkle and luxury, at the world she'd never been part of, had never expected to be part of. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She sat down on one of the white leather benches positioned throughout the showroom. These benches were meant for tired companions of serious shoppers, or perhaps for customers taking a break between viewing sessions. They were not meant for women like her. Raymond's expression flickered with irritation. "Ma'am, as I mentioned, we're closing." "I'd like to speak with the owner," Margaret said. Her voice was still quiet, still gentle, but there was something new in it now. Something firm. Raymond's face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, annoyance, and finally condescension. The owner doesn't typically meet with walk-in customers. If you have a complaint, you can leave it with me or you can visit our website and... I'll wait, Margaret said simply. A few other customers had noticed the interaction now. An older woman in pearls and a fur stole whispered to her companion. A young man in an expensive tracksuit watched while pretending to examine a display. Even the Harrisons had emerged from their private viewing area, Mrs. Harrison's face curious and slightly amused. Raymond's professional mask was slipping. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting our business." "I'm sitting quietly on a bench," Margaret pointed out. "I haven't raised my voice. I haven't touched anything. I'm simply waiting to speak with the owner." "You can't just demand to see the owner," Raymond said, his voice rising slightly. "That's not how this works. You need an appointment. What's going on here?" Everyone turned toward the voice. A woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed in a gray suit with her silver hair cut in a stylish bob, had emerged from a door Margaret hadn't noticed before. She had the kind of face that age had made more interesting rather than less, with laugh lines around her eyes and a commanding presence. Raymond's face went pale. "Mrs. Belmont, I apologize for the disturbance. I was just explaining to this woman that she needs to leave." Mrs. Belmont, one of the owners. Margaret felt her heart beat a little faster. The woman looked at Margaret with sharp, intelligent eyes. "And why exactly does she need to leave, Raymond? She's been here for over 30 minutes, not making any purchases, just looking around. And now she's refusing to leave when I've explained that we're closing for lunch service." Mrs. Belmont's gaze shifted to the showroom, where Victoria was still helping a customer, where Daniel was carefully replacing items in a display case, where life was clearly continuing as normal. "I see," she said dryly. "And tell me, Raymond, when did we start this lunch service policy?" Raymond opened his mouth, then closed it. His face went from pale to red. Mrs. Belmont walked over to where Margaret sat and extended her hand. "I'm Catherine Belmont. I own this establishment along with my brother." "And you are?" Margaret stood and shook her hand. "Margaret Chen." "Well, Mrs. Chen, I apologize for the treatment you've received in my store today. Why don't you come upstairs to my office and you can tell me what you were hoping to find?" The showroom had gone completely quiet. Everyone was watching now. Victoria stood frozen, a necklace still in her hands. Raymond looked like he wanted the marble floor to open up and swallow him whole. Margaret picked up her old purse and followed Catherine Belmont toward the door that led upstairs. As she walked past Raymond, she paused and said quietly, "You know, my husband used to say that every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. He said you should treat everyone with kindness because you never know what someone might be going through or who they might be." Raymond said nothing. He just stood there, watching as this ordinary-looking woman in her worn dress and old shoes followed the owner of Belmont and Sterling up the stairs, away from the showroom where she'd been made to feel so small. And in her purse, Margaret's fingers touched that envelope again, the one that contained the letter that explained exactly who she was and what she could do. Catherine Belmont's office was nothing like the showroom below. Where the showroom was all glass and chrome and carefully curated luxury, this space felt lived in and real. Books lined one wall, not the decorator kind arranged by color, but actual books with worn spines and dog-eared pages. A large wooden desk sat by the window, its surface covered with papers, a laptop, photographs in simple frames, and a coffee mug with a chip on the rim. The other walls displayed photographs of jewelry pieces, but also family photos and what looked like vacation snapshots. "Please, sit," Catherine said, gesturing to a comfortable-looking chair across from her desk. She settled into her own chair and studied Margaret with those sharp eyes. "Can I offer you some coffee, tea? Or perhaps some of that champagne my staff seems so selective about offering?" There was a wry humor in her voice that made Margaret relax slightly. "Tea would be lovely, thank you." Catherine pressed a button on her desk phone. "Beverly, could you bring up 2 cups of tea, please?" "Thank you." She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands in her lap. "Now, Mrs. Chen, why don't you tell me what brought you to my store today?" Margaret sat quietly for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Where did she even begin? With Thomas's death 2 months ago? With their life together, 42 years of marriage? With the envelope in her purse that had changed everything? With the promise made so long ago that she'd come here to keep? "I wanted to buy some jewelry," she said finally. It sounded simple when she said it like that, almost silly given everything that had happened downstairs. "And my staff made you feel unwelcome," Catherine said. It wasn't a question. "They made assumptions," Margaret said carefully, "based on how I look. What I'm wearing. My age, perhaps. They decided I wasn't worth their time." Catherine sighed, a deep sound that seemed to come from somewhere tired inside her. "I'm afraid that's become more common than I'd like to admit. This business, it attracts a certain kind of person. People who equate net worth with human worth. People who've forgotten that every piece in that showroom exists because someone, somewhere felt love or hope or joy or commitment, not because of status symbols and price tags." There was a knock at the door, and a woman in her 50s entered with a tray bearing 2 delicate china cups filled with steaming tea. She set it on the desk with a smile, glancing curiously at Margaret before leaving. Catherine handed Margaret one of the cups. "My late husband and I started this business 38 years ago. He was the jeweler, the artist. I handled the business side. We wanted to create a place where people could find beautiful things to mark the beautiful moments in their lives. Engagements, anniversaries, births, achievements. We wanted every customer to feel special, because they were special. They were trusting us to be part of their story." She took a sip of her tea, looking out the window at the city beyond. "But he passed away 5 years ago. Heart attack. He was only 62. And since then, well, I've found it harder to maintain that vision. My brother helps run the business, but he's more focused on the bottom line. And I've hired people like Raymond, people who bring in the wealthy clients and the big sales. I've compromised, Mrs. Chen, and I'm not proud of it." Margaret listened, seeing something in this successful businesswoman that she recognized. Grief, loneliness, the struggle of continuing on when your partner is gone. She'd felt all of those things these past 2 months. "I'm sorry about your husband," Margaret said softly. Catherine smiled, sad but genuine, "And I'm sorry about whatever happened downstairs. Now tell me what you're really looking for. And please be honest with me." Margaret set her teacup down and opened her purse. Her fingers found the envelope, the one she'd carried every day since it arrived. She pulled it out and handed it to Catherine. The envelope was from Sterling & Associates, one of the oldest investment firms in the city. Catherine opened it and pulled out the letter inside, unfolding it carefully. Her eyes scanned the page, and Margaret watched her expression change from polite interest to surprise to something like shock. The letter was straightforward, written in that formal language lawyers and financial people use, but the meaning was clear enough. Thomas Chen had passed away, leaving his entire estate to his wife, Margaret Chen. The estate consisted primarily of stock holdings in Tech Vista Corporation, shares that Thomas had acquired in 1994 when he worked as a janitor for the company during its startup phase. Back then, Tech Vista was just 5 people in a garage, trying to create software they believed would change how businesses managed their data. They couldn't afford to pay Thomas much, so they'd offered him a choice, a small raise or stock options. Thomas had talked it over with Margaret, and they decided to take the stock. It seemed like a long shot, but Thomas believed in the young people who were working so hard on their dream. 30 years later, Tech Vista was worth billions. It was the software backbone of thousands of major corporations, and Thomas had held on to every single share, never selling, never cashing out. He'd continued working as a janitor, later as a maintenance supervisor, living modestly and quietly. He'd saved money in more traditional ways too, putting aside what he could from each paycheck. But those stock shares, those had grown and split and grown again over 3 decades. The letter stated the total value of the estate, $47,200,000. Catherine slowly lowered the letter, her eyes wider. "Guys, Mrs. Chen, this is... I don't even know what to say." "Neither did I when I received it," Margaret said. "Thomas never told me. I knew he had some stock from the old days, but I thought it was worth maybe a few $1,000s. Something we could use for retirement, perhaps. I had no idea. Why didn't he tell you?" Catherine asked, not unkindly, just curious. Margaret had thought about this question a lot over the past 2 months. "I think he wanted to surprise me. He kept saying he was waiting for the right time. Or maybe he was afraid of how it might change things between us. We'd always been happy with what we had. We didn't need much. We had each other. We had our daughter and grandchildren. We had our health until his heart started giving him trouble. Money was never what mattered to us." She paused, remembering the night of their wedding, standing in that tiny apartment they'd rented. They'd been so young, so full of hopes and dreams. On our wedding night, Thomas made me a promise. He said that someday when we made it, when we were successful, he was going to buy me diamonds. Real diamonds that sparkled like stars. He said I deserved beautiful things. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes but blinked them away. I told him I didn't need diamonds. I just needed him, and I meant it. But he never forgot that promise. In his will, there was a note. He said he was sorry he couldn't be there to buy me the diamonds himself, but he hoped I would do it for both of us. He wanted me to buy something beautiful and think of him every time I saw it. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "That's one of the most beautiful love stories I've heard in a very long time." We had 42 years together, Margaret said. Not enough. It's never enough. But I'm grateful for every single day. She wiped her eyes, composing herself. I came to your store today because I wanted to keep that promise. I wanted to buy jewelry, not just for me, but for my daughter Linda, for my 3 granddaughters. I wanted to buy pieces for the women at the shelter where I volunteer, women who've never owned anything valuable in their lives. I wanted to do something that would have made Thomas smile. And instead my staff treated you like you were nothing, Catherine said, anger creeping into her voice now. Like you were wasting their precious time. Margaret shook her head. They didn't know. How could they? I look like exactly what I am. An older woman who's worn the same clothes for years, who takes the bus instead of driving a fancy car, who probably doesn't look like she has 2 dimes to rub together. They made a judgment based on what they saw. We all do that, don't we? The difference is whether we let those judgments dictate how we treat people. That's generous of you, Catherine said. More generous than they deserve. Maybe, Margaret agreed. But Thomas taught me something important. He taught me that carrying anger is like carrying a heavy stone. It weighs you down, and it doesn't hurt the people who wronged you half as much as it hurts you, so I try not to carry stones anymore. Catherine stood and walked to the window looking down at the showroom below. From this angle, Margaret could see the sales floor. Victoria was showing something to a customer. Raymond was at his desk looking stressed. Daniel was organizing a display, his young face focused on his work. You know what the sad thing is? Catherine said. This happens more often than people realize. We judge books by their covers every single day. That person in the worn coat might be a millionaire who just doesn't care about fashion. That quiet person sitting alone might be a genius working on something that will change the world. That elderly person we dismiss might have lived a life full of experiences and wisdom we can't even imagine. She turned back to Margaret. I built this business on the idea that every customer deserves respect and dignity. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I got focused on the bottom line, on competing with other luxury stores, on attracting the wealthy clientele. I forgot what really matters. It's easy to forget, Margaret said. The world pushes us to value the wrong things. Money and status and appearance. But those things are just wrapping paper. What matters is what's inside. Catherine sat back down at her desk, her expression thoughtful. Mrs. Chen, if you still want to purchase jewelry from my store, I would be honored to help you personally. And I promise you will receive the treatment you should have received from the moment you walked in, the treatment every customer should receive. Margaret felt relief wash over her. She'd been afraid somewhere deep down that even after showing the letter, even after explaining everything, she might still be turned away, that somehow she still wouldn't be good enough for this place. I would like that, she said, but I have one condition. Catherine raised her eyebrows. What's that? I want Victoria to help me. I want her to be the one to show me the pieces, to ring up the sale, to receive the commission. Catherine looked stunned. Mrs. Chen, that woman was rude to you. She tried to get you to leave. She made you feel unwelcome in my store. Why on earth would you want to reward her with what will likely be one of the largest sales she's ever made? Margaret smiled, and it was a smile that held years of wisdom and kindness and understanding. Because 25 years ago I was a young woman working as a waitress in a busy restaurant. I was struggling to make ends meet, raising a daughter while Thomas worked multiple jobs. And one day I was having the worst shift of my life. Everything was going wrong. I was tired and stressed and scared about how we were going to pay that month's rent. She remembered that day so clearly, even after all these years. I had a table of business people, wealthy folks having a long lunch. They were demanding and rude, treating me like I was invisible except when they wanted something. And I'll admit I wasn't at my best. I was short with them, not friendly like I should have been. I was letting my stress show. What happened? Catherine asked. When they left, I expected no tip. Or maybe a few coins just to make a point. But instead, I found a $100 bill under a plate. And a note that said everyone has bad days. Tomorrow will be better. Keep going. That money paid our rent that month. But more than that, that kindness, that grace from someone I'd treated poorly, it changed something in me. It reminded me that we're all human, all struggling, all worthy of second chances. Margaret looked Catherine in the eye. Victoria made a mistake. She judged me unfairly, but she's young and she's probably been taught to prioritize certain customers over others. She probably feels pressure to make sales, to succeed in a competitive business. She probably has her own struggles and fears and dreams. Punishing her won't change what happened, but maybe showing her grace will change what happens next. For the next person who walks into this store wearing worn shoes and an old dress. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled, and this time it reached her eyes, warm and genuine. Mrs. Chen, you are a remarkable woman. Your husband was a lucky man. I was the lucky one, Margaret said softly. And now I'd like to keep the promise we made to each other all those years ago. Catherine picked up her desk phone and pressed a button. Beverly, please ask Victoria to come up to my office immediately. She paused, then added, and tell Raymond I need to see him afterward. While they waited, Margaret sipped her tea and looked around the office again. There was a photograph on Catherine's desk showing a couple standing in front of what looked like a small shop. The man was handsome, with dark hair and kind eyes. The woman was clearly a younger Catherine, her face bright with excitement and hope. That was opening day, Catherine said, noticing Margaret's gaze. We were so nervous. We'd invested everything we had into that little store. It was barely 600 square feet, nothing like what we have now. But we were so proud, so full of dreams. He had a good face, Margaret said. You can see the kindness in it. He did, Catherine agreed, her voice soft. He was the best person I've ever known. He saw the good in everyone. He would have liked you, Mrs. Chen. He would have appreciated your generosity toward Victoria. There was a sharp knock at the door, and Victoria entered. Her confident demeanor from downstairs was gone, replaced by barely concealed nervousness. Her eyes darted from Catherine to Margaret and back again, clearly trying to figure out what was happening. Victoria, please sit down, Catherine said, gesturing to the chair beside Margaret. Victoria sat on the edge of the chair, her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Margaret could see the fear in her eyes, the anxiety. She was probably thinking she was about to be fired, and honestly, Margaret thought, maybe she expected to be. Victoria, I want you to look at Mrs. Chen and tell me what you see, Catherine said. Victoria glanced at Margaret, confused. I'm sorry, I don't understand. What do you see when you look at her? Describe what you notice, Victoria's face flushed. She clearly knew this was some kind of test, but she didn't know the right answer. I see. A customer? Be specific, Catherine pushed. What kind of customer? Victoria's flush deepened. She's an older woman. She's dressed casually. She's carrying an older purse. She doesn't look like... She trailed off, realizing where this was going. She doesn't look like she can afford to shop at Belmont and Sterling, Catherine finished for her. That's what you thought, isn't it? That's why you tried to send her to Macy's. That's why you didn't offer her champagne or your attention. Because you decided, based on her appearance, that she wasn't worth your time. Victoria looked down at her hands. I'm sorry, she whispered. I shouldn't have assumed. No, you shouldn't have, Catherine agreed. But you did. And do you know why that's a problem? Beyond the obvious rudeness of it? Victoria shook her head, still not meeting anyone's eyes. Because you have no idea who anyone really is, Catherine continued. That woman in the worn dress could be a millionaire who doesn't care about fashion. That man in the simple suit could be a tech genius worth billions. That elderly person you dismiss could be someone whose life experiences and wisdom dwarf anything you've learned in your 26 years. She picked up the envelope from her desk and handed it to Victoria. Read this. Victoria took the envelope with shaking hands and pulled out the letter. Margaret watched her face as she read, saw her eyes widen, saw her mouth fall open slightly. When she finished, she looked up at Margaret with an expression of pure shock. 47 million? She whispered. Dollars, Catherine confirmed. Mrs. Chen came into our store today planning to make a significant purchase. Multiple pieces. For herself and as gifts for her family and others. She was a serious customer, Victoria. The kind of customer who could have made your entire year in terms of commission, and you tried to send her to a department store. Victoria looked like she might cry. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Chen. I was rude and presumptuous and completely unprofessional. I have no excuse." Margaret saw herself in this young woman, saw the fear and shame and regret. She remembered being young and making mistakes, remembered the kindness that others had shown her, the grace that had helped her grow into a better person. "Victoria," Margaret said gently, "may I ask you something?" Victoria nodded, not trusting her voice. "Why do you work here?" The question seemed to surprise Victoria. She blinked, thinking, I've always loved beautiful things. Jewelry especially. The artistry of it. The way a perfect piece can make someone feel special, and I'm good at sales. I like helping people find the right piece for their occasion." "Do you enjoy the work?" Margaret asked. "Yes," Victoria said, and for the first time there was genuine emotion in her voice. "I really do. When I help someone find their engagement ring, or when I see a mother's face when she buys earrings for her daughter's graduation, it's special. It matters. Then why treat some customers differently than others?" Margaret asked. "If you love helping people find beautiful things, why deny that help to someone based on their appearance?" Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, voice barely above a whisper, "Because I've been taught that time is money, that I need to focus on the customers who will actually buy something, who can afford our pieces, that I can't waste time on people who are just looking or who clearly can't afford anything. The pressure to meet sales quotas, to compete with the other associates, it's intense." She looked at Catherine. "I'm not making excuses. What I did was wrong. But that's the culture here. Raymond tells us all the time to identify the real customers, to not waste our time on tire kickers. He says we need to be selective about who we give our attention to." Catherine's expression darkened. "Does he now?" "We'll be addressing that shortly." She turned to Margaret. "Mrs. Chen, the choice is yours. Would you like someone else to help you? Or would you prefer to shop at another establishment entirely? I would understand either choice." Margaret looked at Victoria, really looked at her. She saw a young woman who'd made a mistake, yes, but also someone who genuinely loved her work, who had reasons for her behavior, even if those reasons didn't excuse it. She saw someone who could learn from this, could grow, could become better. "I meant what I said," Margaret told Catherine. "I'd like Victoria to help me make my purchases." She turned to Victoria. "If you're willing to, that is." Victoria's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Chen, I don't deserve your kindness. I was terrible to you." "Maybe," Margaret agreed. "But we all deserve second chances. Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we do after we make them. So here's what I'm proposing. You help me today. You give me your best service. You treat me the way you should have treated me from the beginning. And in return, you'll receive the commission from this sale. But more importantly, you'll remember this day. And the next time someone walks into this store wearing worn shoes and an old dress, you'll remember that you don't know their story. You don't know what they're capable of, what they've lived through, what they might be worth in ways that have nothing to do with money." Victoria wiped her eyes, smearing her carefully applied mascara. "I will. I promise you I will never make this mistake again." Catherine stood up. "Then let's go downstairs and begin. Victoria, you'll give Mrs. Chen a private viewing in our VIP suite. You'll show her our finest pieces. You'll offer her champagne, tea, coffee, whatever she prefers. You'll take all the time she needs, and you'll treat her like the valued customer she is." "Yes, ma'am," Victoria said, standing as well. She looked at Margaret with something like awe. "Thank you. Thank you for this chance." As they prepared to leave the office, Margaret said, "Victoria, can I give you one piece of advice? Something my husband taught me?" "Of course," Victoria said. "Every person you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. The woman who seems rude might have just lost a loved one. The man who appears arrogant might be covering for deep insecurity. The elderly person who moves slowly might be dealing with pain you can't imagine. And the person in old clothes might have riches you can't see. Not just money, but love and wisdom and experiences that have shaped them into who they are. Treat everyone with kindness because you never know what someone is carrying, or who they might be." Victoria nodded, and Margaret could see that she really heard it, really understood. They made their way down the stairs, and as they entered the showroom, every head turned. Raymond stood up from his desk, his face pale. Daniel stopped what he was doing, watching with wide eyes. Other customers paused their browsing, Sensing that something significant was happening,